So I'm continuing to read in Bonhoeffer's Letter and Papers from Prison, specifically kind of thinking about the context in which we're living, whether it's the political context, the election, and everything that's going along with the election, specifically the way the religion is being used, but also a lot of the things that are happening in the church, different groups kind of doubling down on church discipline, kind of wanting to exclude people who think differently, not wanting to have dialogue, those types of things. And what I've found is Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers in Prison have some interesting things that apply to some of the stuff that's going on. Now, just a reminder, Bonhoeffer is sitting in jail, in prison. I don't think at this point he necessarily is waiting for death. I think eventually he comes to the realization that he's not getting out and he's going to die. But more, he's having this conversation with his friend, and he's trying to think about the impact of this world war and even what has happened with Hitler and the rise of the Nazis, the impact on the church and the impact on Christianity. And so he begins these letters in talking about what is it going to look like? What is the church going to have to contribute to society? How did we talk about God after Christians have torn themselves apart violently? The different Christian nations. So he, in this letter, so this is the letter that comes in April 30, 1944. He is talking to his friend, Eberhard Bethke, and I've already kind of explored a few things about the questions that he's asking. You know, what keeps gnawing at me is this question: what is Christianity? And I think today, as we think about that question, what is Christianity? I mean, there's a lot of tension right now in the church, thinking through whether it's conservative or liberal and what we can talk about and can't talk about, the issue of homosexuality, ripping different denominations apart. What is the gospel? And that seems to be the question that Bonhoeffer is asking. What is the gospel? And what is that going to look like after the war? So I just want to read here a little bit what Bonhoeffer writes. So kind of continuing on where I left off before, it says, the questions to be answered would be. So here are the questions that he's thinking through. What does a church, congregation, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? So a couple of things to talk about here. One of the things he's grappling with is this question of whether or not humanity has within us an innate sense of religion or a draw to God or divinity. And for a long time, the assumption was that human beings have this kind of religious a priori, this religiosity, this sense of spirit within us that pulls us into some kind of worship of God or a God or whatever. And he is beginning to question this. He's asking questions about this. He doesn't necessarily at this point come out and deny it, but he is asking questions about this. And so the term religionless is saying, if this isn't true, if human beings don't have this, in other words, if religion is a historical or cultural construct within human beings, doesn't mean it's any less real. It just means that it's not something that is kind of buried deep within us. He's asking the question then about how do we talk about God then in a religionless world where religion disappears? And so he is making a distinction between religion and religious practice and metaphysics. He'll talk about that here in a minute. and the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. So making that distinction is important for Bonhoeffer. And that's what he seems to be doing here. So he's asking that question, like, what are all of these things? What are these things going to mean in a religion in this world? What is preaching going to look like? What is a liturgy going to look like? And again, he's not denying the importance of any of these things, but he's asking in a post-World War II world, what is this going to look like? So then he goes on, how do we talk about God without religion, that is, without the temporally conditioned presuppositions of metaphysics, the inner life, and so on? So one of the things he's pushing against is this kind of philosophical understanding of metaphysics, that God is the great guarantee. So when you hear people arguing about truth and why we need to stand up for truth in this way and that, one of the things that they're doing is they're positing this belief that there is this absolute truth that is the guarantee of human existence or the world. And what I mean by guarantee is that they can go back to it. So our vision of the world is right because this idea of God or the religious has an existence, an objective existence somewhere out there. And so what Bonhoeffer is suggesting is that faith is going to have to jettison this metaphysics that has for so long undergirded Christian belief. But then he's asking, like, how do you talk about God in that context? And so he says here, about metaphysics, the inner life, and so on. So what is the inner life a reference to? For some, it was the escape to the inner life, to the moral, to the pious, to kind of an inner faith, an inner belief, was a way to kind of leave the world and all the different things that are happening, progress, science, and so on, and say, okay, well, maybe faith isn't about that. Faith is about this kind of inner, almost monastic, but that's a little unfair, kind of retreat to this inner spirituality. And we see that today, I think, in the way that so many churches, Protestant churches, especially maybe even Catholic and Orthodox, want to move into this pious kind of representation of what it means to be a Christian. So to be a Christian is to have this version of spirituality. Everybody has to have the same kind of almost neo-Pentecostal, charismatic spirituality and spiritual experience. And usually that happens in worship or whatever. And so, you know, one of the things that's happening in Protestant churches, evangelical churches, is such a heavy emphasis is being placed upon music and the worship experience, because there's this inner piety and inner expression that needs to come out. And I understand it's in public worship, but it's this kind of between you and God type of moment. And Bonhoeffer is suggesting that that's done, that that's not what faith is, what Christianity is, and that somehow religionless Christianity is going to have to speak to something more than that. Again, I don't think Bonhoeffer is saying it's wrong for people to have these inner experiences of God, but that's not the totality of what Christian faith is. So then he goes on to say, how do we speak, or perhaps we can no longer even speak the way we used to, in a worldly way about God? How do we go about being religious, less worldly Christians? How can we be the ecclesia? So he's got the Greek in here, and the ecclesia is the word that's used for Christian community in the New Testament. Those who are called out without understanding ourselves religiously as privileged, but instead seeing ourselves as belonging wholly to the world. So you can see the move that he's making. What he's saying is the church is going to have to move from being a community and an organization that is inwardly focused, that's putting up barriers to say there's an in and an out. Are you a part of the people of God, or are you not a part of the people of God? And what becomes the thing that marks that or says you're in or out? And And we see that today. I mean, homosexuality right now, this whole sexuality conversation has become this measuring stick of whether you are orthodox or not. And it's on both sides. So whether you're conservative or progressive, do you hold the right view regardless of where that is? And so you create these little communities and you throw up these little boundaries that are marking out what it means to be the ecclesia or to be the church. And what Bonhoeffer is suggesting is that those boundaries are being erased, that religion and piety and all of this is no longer, after World War II, going to be those markers. So what does it now mean to be the church? And you'll see for Bonhoeffer, it's about a movement out. It's a movement out into the world. He has a poem that comes a little bit later where he's talking about the difference between Christians and heathens. And at the end, he says that Christ died on the cross for both Christians and heathens and saved all of them. There's this movement of wanting to break down those distinctions between a Christian and whoever else in the world. And so he says then, well, first of all, I think religiously is privileged. I mean, that's the interesting thing. So right now, as we're watching, the political conventions take place. I mean, how many times is the Bible going to be quoted at the Republican convention? How many times are they going to declare that God is on the side of Donald Trump? And you can do the same thing with the Democrats. I'm sure there will be, prayers and Bible verses and, whose side is God on type of thing. And again, that's the privileging. And Bonhoeffer is saying that that's over, that's done. And also the language that we use. And it's almost as if we're living at a time when Christian language is being so overused in so many different ways. It's being rendered meaningless. So how do you now really talk about God with somebody? How do you speak about who Jesus Christ is for the world when our religious Christian language is being used now politically, culturally, in a lot of different ways? This is what Bonhoeffer is thinking about. This is what he's wrestling with in this letter. And then to say, but instead seeing ourselves as belonging wholly to the world. That being the church is to be holy, and Rowan Williams talks about this. To be holy is to be called out, to be to be set apart, but not, to be set apart because you're privileged, but you're set apart because God is now going to send you back in to proclaim the good news. In other words, to be holy is to enter into the muck and the mire of the world, to follow Jesus Christ to the cross. But again, wholly belonging to the world, that the world is not antithetical to faith, but that is where we live faith out, and that is where we're called to go. And then it says, Christ would no longer then be the object of religion, but something else entirely, truly Lord of the world. That the lordship of Christ extends to the world, and God is not abdicating or leaving the world behind in Christian faith. And you could almost, you could almost have this sense of, in the Christian community, the emphasis that we place upon, oh, we love Jesus, or, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, and we turn Jesus into this abstraction, where here Bonhoeffer seems to be suggesting that the lordship of Christ is demonstrated in the world, and that we're called back out to love our neighbor, love God and love Jesus Christ in our concrete neighbor. And so everything that Bonhoeffer is doing here is wanting to move Christianity and faith away from abstraction, these kind of abstract metaphysical concepts, back into a way of life that is lived in the world and for the world. And does this provide a way of thinking about what it means to be Christian now in a world where Christian language is being rendered powerless, like meaningless? It's being co-opted in so many different ways. One place, Bonhoeffer earlier, he talks about how maybe we just need to shut up. Maybe we don't need to preach sermons for a while. Maybe we should stop preaching sermons for a while until we can finally find a language that isn't co-opted by whatever cultural force it's being co-opted by. This is what Bonhoeffer's asking in the context of Nazi Germany. And I think it applies to today. It's a real challenge, I think, to the Christian community of what does it mean now to be a Christian and to live in this world that is in which Christ is Lord of all of it, every part of it. So that's the thought for today, kind of thinking about Bonhoeffer, his papers and letters in prison. And I want to keep thinking about this whole idea of a religionless Christianity. What does that look like? What does it mean? And I need to remind people that, of course, Bonhoeffer believes in God and in Jesus Christ and in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I do too. This is not about becoming some kind of weird agnostic or atheist or whatever. And I think a better understanding of the death of God in Nietzsche is the death of the metaphysical God, the death of the abstract God. It doesn't have to mean that there is no God. It means now there's a freedom to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Jesus Christ. And it seems to me that's what Bonhoeffer is wanting to do and where Bonhoeffer is wanting to push us. And I want to keep coming back to that idea, because what would it be like if churches and Christian communities began to live out this religionless form? What does it mean to gather together on a Sunday to prepare ourselves to go back out into the world and meet God in our neighbor and meet God in the concrete people that we meet, helping them become fully human in Jesus Christ. So that's it for today, and we'll pick up here next time and kind of keep exploring this idea of religionless Christianity.